Okay, so we have a full room. Welcome to SRE Culture Fundamentals, this panel. So let me just go ahead and, we have 4 people. Let me just introduce everybody to the room first. So first of all, we have Pedro Kanawati. Pedro leads infrastructure production engineering groups at Facebook, where he oversees teams scaling the infrastructure and making sure it's always available. Prior to this, Pedro worked at various startups related to popular culture and social media, and companies like Vario, NTT, building the backbone and its data centers. To my right is Kevin Park. Kevin leads technical operations at Dropbox. Previously, Kevin was director of technical operations at Facebook from 2006 to 2011. On the end here is Aveline Vig. Aveline is a staff operations engineer at Etsy, where he spends much of his time growing the infrastructure for selling knitted gloves and cross-stitch periodic tables. His words. Before joining Etsy, he worked at several large tech companies, including Earthlink and Google, as well as a number of small successful startups in Europe and the United States. And finally, on the right here is Greer Johnson. Greer is currently a production engineer at Square. Prior to that, he managed the search advertising service engineering team at Yahoo and helped build the first SRE team at LinkedIn. My name is Tom Cook. I'm the moderator for this. I'm currently an SRE at Dropbox, and I've previously been at Facebook, Quora, and Amazon Web Services. So let me just read the abstract here so we can basically structure the discussion that we want to have with the room. The abstract for the talk is SRE, production engineer, or DevOps. Regardless of what you call the role at your company, it's the engineering that truly defines the work of the engineer who is focused on the reliability of the product. But without a culture that defines the role appropriately in the company, you could be just another operations team. We're here to discuss how to make sure that SRE is part of engineering and that the team is focused on the right work. So hopefully you're interested in that. So let's basically just kick it off. We want to definitely solicit questions from you guys. This is definitely a discussion in the room. But I'll just start with a question basically for everybody on the panel. In your current role at your current company or in the past, what does SRE mean to you and to your company? I'll start with. You're not a lefty, you're a righty. Why'd you go to the left?
So let's see. So we call it production engineering at Facebook. It's PE for short, not quite the name SRE. But to me, effectively, SRE is people who have a unique set of skills that really makes them problem solvers first and probably builders second. Right? Like software engineers typically build something, they put it out there, and then once they see that it doesn't work, they then try to solve the problem. And production engineers really think a little bit opposite to that. And so they bring those sorts of skills to make sure that the software that they're building is reliable and scalable, that you can deploy it in an automated fashion, and it's actually repeatable every time you deploy it. And then they bring that knowledge and discipline to the software engineering teams to make sure that everything stays up and running.
I think that's very accurate. In addition, I'd add they are people who have very strong collaborative skills. People who are very good at working with other teams, bringing teams together. You as an SRE, as a DevOps person, production engineer, whatever you want to call it, you're sort of in a central role in your organization. And whereas other development teams, may work together, they may not work together. Everyone does tend to come through you when it comes to production and operation and stuff. So it's definitely people who are good at sort of tying together different loose ends and making things happen.
So at Square, we have a PE team as well. It's a little bit different than most SRE teams, so what I'll qualify it as is it's mostly a series of automation junkies. It's a group of people that got really, really tired of doing things in any sort of manual way whatsoever. We want to be able to use code to do just about every facet of our life all the time, and that'd be super awesome. And then we'll relax while scripts do everything that we've ever wanted to do. Until that illustrious goal is solved, though, we get to write all the infrastructure that helps do that sort of thing. So that's that's been a really interesting thing at Square, in that the PE team doesn't actually support anybody else's software. The dev teams all do their own software, whereas the PE team is actually its own engineering team in its own right that exists solely to make the lives of everyone else easier to work with production in a more interesting and beautiful way.
So at Dropbox, we do call it SRE, and we have an interesting infrastructure in that it's a hybrid infrastructure. So we have public cloud environment as well as private infrastructure. So we end up having SRE that supports both environments from an abstraction level, from infrastructure all the way up to the application. Having obviously private infrastructure as well, you end up having some specialized roles. So we can discuss that in the future. But we end up having some specialized role for systems engineering, obviously some specific software sets for, let's say, Hadoop, MySQL, as well as generalized software engineering. As Pedro said, I think it's a builder and problem solver role. I think what we want to have an ideal world scenario is we start off in more 50-50 and getting to more of an 80-20 of builder and problem solver in the future through automation and all the things that we want to do. That's the evolution of that we go through, obviously based on the needs of the requirements of the company, the organization, and the engineering organization.
Let me just ask real quick, of everyone in the crowd, and I guess on stage too, how many of you are currently in a managerial role at your company? Okay. Cool. And I assume everyone else is in an individual contributor sort of role, right? Is there anything else? I don't think so.
That's a profound question.
Right, yeah. What are you doing here? Tell us. Okay, so one question for the team. I think everyone here has led SRE teams before. What are some specific areas, how does it differ managing SREs from, say, for example, software engineers? Like, what are the specific demands that they place on a manager versus other technical roles within an organization?
I can start with this one. I think one of the things that I think all of us have to balance correctly, especially for SRE, is interruption. So we end up having to firefight a lot. Obviously, that's a goal that we want to avoid in the future, but through automation, right monitoring, and processes. But in the end, it is a lot more balancing of interruptions, firefighting, versus project work that we want to do in the long term. So I think that's one of the biggest differences that I've seen in terms of managing software engineering teams, more strictly infrastructure teams versus SRE teams. And then setting those right priorities and balancing out how do you handle those project work in a sprint manner, long-term planning, and balancing that throughout the day and throughout the weeks.
Yeah, I'm gonna have to totally agree with that one. When I actually had to do that sort of management, I acted as a much bigger buffer and firewall between my employees and the people that actually wanted to take their time away. And so that became a really big balancing act between the project work and the interruption work. It's always been strange to me how easy people find it to walk up to the SREs and just like tap them on the shoulder and say, hey, you look really involved in something, but let me interrupt you anyways. If you saw a software engineer with his headphones on staring at a screen full of code, you probably would turn around and walk away and come back some other time. But that isn't always the case with an SRE.
Yeah, so I mean, they've said a bunch of stuff already, but I think that for me, one of the key differences is that people who like the role of SRE or production engineers, they will tend to complain about the fact that they don't like the context switch, but in effect, they actually do like the context switch. And it's a big difference between a software engineer and an operations engineer who really wants to do different things, where a software engineer is happy to sort of like put their headphones on and work on one problem for 8 hours, multiple days in a row, and it's still the same problem they're trying to solve. Eventually, they will solve it. Production engineers, operations folks really kind of like to do a little bit more of that kind of stuff, right? Like the phrase is jack of all trades, master of none. But in fact, what I've found is that it's jack of all trades and master of some. You actually do want to be able to do some of those things in a very deep manner. So managing the production engineers has to be that their career paths are a little bit different. The things that they're interested in are just slightly a little bit different. You need to make sure that they don't fall into that sort of like 100% operations role where they get everything dumped on them. So you have to coach them on how to deal with that and how to talk to their software engineering counterparts, just because it's the role that they're in, but they've never played the other side of the role typically. So.
For the last 15 years, I've done my utmost to avoid managing anyone, so I'm probably the worst person to answer this question. But looking at it from the other side, it's been kind of interesting. We've had a cultural shift in the industry where we're moving away from people who are just focused on operations to more of an SRE kind of culture and environment, encouraging people to move in that direction. One of the challenges that I've seen is trying to get people who have a very operations mindset and only an operations mindset, and trying to kind of like you're talking about Peter, just getting them to think more about other ways of working, learning other skills, learning how to actually write software and things. That's definitely a big piece of it, I think.
Okay. Sometimes it can be easy for SREs and operations people to get shoehorned into, like you said, like you guys have kind of alluded to, is the grind of work. What are some techniques, and how does SRE kind of prove its value to the organization? Whatever you call SRE, or whatever the operations role is, the people doing that kind of job. How do you prove that, for example, you're having an impact and that your contribution is actually valuable to the company?
I think kind of going back to the collaboration point, one of the tools that we use at Etsy, we have a smaller team, our operations team, so our production engineers. I want to say there's 8 to 10 of us in total on the team now, so it's a slightly smaller team than a lot of the bigger companies. But we found we can add a lot of value by allocating those people out to other project teams and kind of fostering those strong social relationships and getting people to talk more and just getting people to interact more. Just lets those software engineers that they're working with really kind of say, okay, I feel comfortable talking to these people, and now I know how to approach somebody and talk about infrastructure and talk about what my new software that I'm writing is going to do and how it's going to interact with the system and how it's going to impact other things. And I think a lot of value really comes from sort of building those social dimensions out.
Yeah, I'd say that there's I know it's a kind of a loaded question, I think, to say that, like, how do you add value to a company? But I'll give you an anecdote here, which is like when I started at Facebook, the operations team was really not well known. People in the company didn't know what they were doing. They kind of threw things over the fence. They sort of said, like, there's a sysadmin team over there that, like, they do something, they keep the site up and running, I think. I'm not quite sure what they do. And then over the years, as we progressed and added value, now people are coming to us and saying, like, oh my God, can we have production engineers on our team, because you guys add a lot of value to making sure that the system is scalable, that it's reliable, that it's up and running. You build tools that actually give you abilities to deploy things, and you build a lot of automation so that humans don't have to be involved in a lot of problems. I'd say the other way that, honestly, like, production engineers add a lot of value is they fix a bunch of shit, right? Like, there's a lot of stuff that's broken in production, and they really dig in and look at what those problems are. They'll work with their software engineering teams, they'll work with whoever they need to work with to just get the problem solved.
Yeah, at high levels, obviously our job is to make sure the site is up. And back in the day at Facebook, I don't know if some of you remember, we had a big sign that one of our recruiters put up on the wall. It said, "Site's up, good job." So that kind of embodied obviously what we're trying to do. But at Dropbox, obviously the first order goal we have is to make sure data is secure, available, and reliable. And in the end, SRE is a service organization. It's a service organization to engineering organizations and other groups, and obviously your customers. So that's the kind of core value first. We're providing that need and filling that need. Obviously making sure we're going to improve the infrastructure in a lot of different ways that we've all been talking about throughout the day. So beyond that, I think the values that we provide end up being quantifiable from service availability, SLAs, cost, and a lot of the problems that we fix over time.
Sure. So the value that I think a lot of SREs provide is that they own the production environment as a product, and it gives people a chance to go to a person that owns a product that they're deeply interested in, which is the production environment, and then you get a team full of people that are trusted advisors for helping people successfully operate within that environment, and whether that's automation to help self-service sort of items make the production environment more useful to work with, or whether it's hey, here's a design that we've thought of, what do you think about it? And the first couple times that an SRE actually explains to you, by the way, if it fails that way, it's going to be terrible, and they save you from actually having something be terrible, it's really, really easy to start thinking about, man, these guys know what they're talking about. That's really useful. I'm going to talk to them again next time because that was kind of neat.
Cool. And we're still open for questions too. Go ahead.
So they don't really teach infrastructure and reliability at universities. How do you groom that? Or how do you groom it?
Who wants to take it?
I'll take it.
You cross your fingers and you hope that it all works out. You're right, this is a big problem in our industry. This is something that we need to address. There are a number of groups trying to address it. LOPSA is one organization, very focused on one set of skills, for example, and they're trying to promote those. I started a little group a while back called Op School, which is again trying to teach infrastructure, teach SRE mindsets more than like raw skills. It's more about a mindset. Like you have to actually teach people problem solving and critical thinking, and that kind of stuff is difficult. If you walk into any room like this one and you do a quick survey and ask how many people have a college degree, well, some portion of people put their hands up. Okay, how many people have a college degree in computer science? This turns out, especially if you're talking to a group of SREs, it's not always a huge number. It's because the other degrees that people do tend to teach some of these skills that are important as an operations person or as an SRE. I think we need to focus on teaching those sort of core basics.
It's funny, I was actually going to mention opschool.org, right? So it's an interesting experiment there, by the way. That's pretty cool. I think it is really a big problem in our industry, like Adeline was saying. Today, we build SREs, production engineers, mostly through apprenticeship and mentorship, right? It's kind of like the old trade schools of back in the day. The US, I don't think they exist anymore, but outside of the US, they do. Yeah, exactly right. And so, my sense is that over time, that actually will become something that is being taught in a lot of universities, and it'll be up to us to try and sort of set what the framework would be, what the kinds of roles will be played. I think, though, it's also as we do a lot more cloud infrastructure where a lot of operations tends to be abstracted away, the software aspect of what an SRE does is going to be much more highlighted. So the traditional roles of having software engineering as a background, but learning about systems and sort of tinkering with Linux and that kind of stuff, that's where you'll find the people that actually know what they're doing about this. I would love it if we definitely try to put together some kind of educational program where it teaches you how to do networking, coding, systems, large-scale design, although I don't think anybody really learns large-scale design except for doing it. Yeah.
Yeah, I agree with everybody said, but I guess as we asked, so how many folks here have CS series? So it's a decent number.
Yep.
And I think that's obviously our industry is changing. Advent of obviously infrastructure service, platform as service, things are moving up the stack more and more and more. So I think, as everyone mentioned, software engineering is becoming much more of a core competency for us, and expanding into other areas and learning on the job. But there are some courses that I've seen lately, like UCSD has a course on handling some of the infrastructure work, troubleshooting, debugging, and handling multiple layers. So I think it's beginning to take place a little more, but that's definitely something that we have to work with, that industry work with, obviously universities and education systems to be able to expand that training.
I'll add that along with problem solving, there's a certain mindset of people that look for failure in everything. How will I make this fail? How is this going to fail? Why is it going to fail? What happens when this fails? And that's a skill that's really, really hard to teach. That's just people like to break things. And oftentimes those people go into security and they make really great security people, but when they wind up in SRE, it's especially useful because that particular mindset's hard to come by. I think also we probably need to do a better job of identifying and grooming talent of new college grads. There's been, at LinkedIn and at Square both, I did a lot of hiring, and one of the interesting things to look for is any new college grad that also has like hobbyist projects that point them anywhere towards the system. which means, hey, you were actually curious about that thing that your software runs on. And that's when you can start identifying this is probably a person that's going to be good to groom into something more SRE-like. They've already shown a curiosity outside of the realm of purely typing out Java code. And so they're a good one to maybe point your finger at and say, come on, come learn what this is all about. It's pretty cool.
So actually, a follow-up to what you were saying there. Yeah, absolutely. Getting college grads and new grads coming into the industry is an interesting one from a recruiting perspective. It's an interesting challenge. What we found is that people who go to college and take classes that are around OS design, kernel switching, that kind of stuff, are people that you can probably pull and try to teach them about this. Our experience has been mixed, I think. There are some people who have joined and gone to be really productive and successful production engineers, and others that learned quite a bit about operations and then actually went into software engineering. That's really what they wanted to do in the first place, and they really wanted to sit down and write software all the time. Great. What we did was we seeded somebody who now knows a little bit about operations into a software engineering team, and it makes them so much better.
I'll add one final point. I think one of the things we're missing very much is capturing this talent that we've all been talking about, capturing it early enough. We're talking about college grads, we're talking about people in their early 20s. There's a lot of this interest. Yeah, they're moldable, but I think somebody used the word grooming. But there's a lot of the interest around this kind of stuff can be captured much earlier, even like early high school. And groups like Code.org are aiming at that level, and I think if there was some way that we could do the same thing with sort of SRE, DevOps, like operations, skill sets, and interests, I think it would be a big benefit to us.
So on that point, it's actually been really interesting to see the advent of things like Arduino and Raspberry Pi and stuff like that come back into the world. For a long time, computers were actually kind of easy, which I think made it difficult for people to want to dive into them. They did just basically work for about a decade, which you had sort of a lost half generation there that never had to dive into it and say, how does this work? Because I just want to play my video games. So I think that actually made it a little more difficult to get people that have the mindset of like, I want to troubleshoot everything and figure out what's going on here. It's been interesting. There was a kind of a gap for a while in hiring where it's just like you would get college kids and like, did you ever have to do anything like this? No, my Mac always just worked. It was fine. Stupid Steve Jobs.
Macs never break. We've just been told that. Yeah, more questions?
Chuck.
Nice.
So, SRE sucks at mobile. What are you doing to fix that?
I think that goes to
Can you elaborate on your question?
Good stalling technique. We're all kind of stuck in the back end and watching back end metrics and all that. But the mobile ecosystem is evolving rapidly. The stupid little devices we're all getting cancer with now are really full-fledged computers, right? They got massive cache, multi-core, multi-thread. Like, those are servers that we should pay attention to. And those are metrics coming back from, I got 1 billion people using these little things out in the world, sending back telemetry and metrics, and all you guys have big numbers too. What can SRE do to kind of get into that ecosystem? Because my experience so far on multiple fronts, maybe Etsy is more ahead of this than most. What are we doing as SRE to get into that ecosystem and understanding what impact you can have there?
Who wants to start?
I think that goes to Pedro.
Yes.
I already know his answer to this.
See? Nobody else can do that one.
We have something about mobile, I'm not sure, like some stuff. So I think that what SREP, people who are really in operations can bring to client-side instrumentation is huge. We are people who really spend a lot of time debugging little things, little metrics, like looking at the raw code or bytes across the wire, things that are happening at server-side, yes, but also things that need to be sent back client-side. My sense is actually, honestly, like, build more tools and build more tools like we have on the Unix side, right? Build more tools on the server side that we can actually embed into the devices. Definitely get involved much more on the hardware design aspect of it. Get involved with companies like Apple and Google, and just say, like, like you said, it's a server. Let's actually start adding some instrumentation that we can actually query directly off of it without having to write some low-level API that's like a pain in the ass to, like, SSH into a thing with like a weird password. Like, let's stop doing that. Let's actually add some front-end instrumentation to the device that can be queried real time, that kind of stuff.
I think in addition to that, if you take the view that there are software developers who are still doing the back-end development on the mobile side just as they've done it on the traditional desktop side, the SRE mindset has always paid attention to the rest of the world, specifically like infrastructure. So we should be thinking about how do mobile networks work? How do these devices transmit data? How do different systems interact with each other? You're right. Like you said, they're servers, right? They should have more telemetry. We should be pushing for more information from them, and we should be thinking about how to transmit that information, how to make sure it gets across reliably, how to interpret it, how to store it, how to scale it. Those are the kinds of things that we should be thinking about.
Yeah, and similarly, obviously, a lot of companies these days are mobile first, and a lot of folks say that, and I think that's actually changing now. But I mean, Chuck, you were talking about it before, like just sheer diversity of the different versions that you have to support on different form factors, OSs, and even the app versions, our own app versions that you have to support over time, are becoming massive. So I think it's a lot of the things that we said. Better instrumentation, better integration with the manufacturers, the OS providers, and get deeper into those integration points. We're nowhere near where we need to be. And I think in the last 5 years, the rate of change velocity has increased significantly as well. So can we get to a point where we can catch up? That's the big question. And can we provide the same common frameworks? Obviously, as Chuck alluded earlier in his talk, Android side is getting much better. iOS side is not. So can we put enough pressure and come up with common standards and frameworks that we can push in the industry?
I have a whole lot to add to this. I mean, obviously, there's some things holding back treating it just like a common server in that you can't force someone to carry the traffic for you, but through they have to pay for every little byte that comes down the pipeline. So I think that's a limitation. That's something that we have to think about anyways, and a difficult one to get past. So it's not the same as I can spin up a server that sends me 1 million metrics a minute, and that's awesome. I can do whatever I want with those metrics. A little more difficult to have a phone do that simply because you're just going to blow out their bandwidth pipeline. So I think that's one of the big things. Is like it's easy to be an SRE on a server in your data center because you can do whatever you want with it, and you are the one in charge of the costs that come down the pipeline. It's a little more difficult when you're shunting off to the consumer.
Yeah.
Chuck, to pander to something that you love about a lot. So on the desktop, the nice thing about web services basically is that we were really only paying attention to the browser, right? Everything else was handled for us, and the transport aspect of that, unlike mobile where we actually have to go through a lot of different carriers that care and some of them don't care. The ability to keep people up to date with new software is much easier on server side and also much easier on desktop than it is on mobile. So if anybody here is with Google or Apple SRE that's working on sort of backend systems that allow you to deploy services faster to phones, let's talk. I think we could do that a lot faster. And so it would allow us all to iterate as an organization, as an industry. Like we could actually get software back to the clients much faster so that when there are bugs, the users don't have a really horrible experience. But today, I think we've taken a step back, or a step backwards, and gone slower than we should be. So if we can do that, I think that would be real helpful.
So I guess Kevin kind of alluded to it, that as SRE moves up higher in the stack, software engineering becomes a skill set that's more and more applicable. As sort of sysadmins went to DevOps and DevOps SRE, where do you guys see SRE say 5 years from now? What skill sets outside of problem solving and those those generalist skills, what concrete things do you guys see as being the next generation of talents, if you say, that you need to have?
So I'm going to talk about Square. I really like the way that we're doing it right now, which is that the PE team is actually mostly people that code. My day is spent actually writing Ruby code. And then we act as consultants to the dev teams that are already doing kind of their own support role. And so inside the dev teams, there's obvious people that wind up being a little more on the support side than others. Not so much that there's embedded SRE, but simply that they identify skill sets within them. And so the PE team at Square has been, more and more evolving into we will build the infrastructure that helps you do the right thing. We will integrate the infrastructure that already exists out in the world into the thing that helps you do the right thing. And so I think the natural evolution to very automation and process-minded software engineers seems pretty clear in my mind.
I totally agree with that. Obviously at Dropbox, as I mentioned earlier, we do have some rules for specific technology and products that we support, but there's a base underlying assumption that everyone should understand code, be able to contribute to that. And I think overall industry-wise, there's going to be fewer and fewer companies in the future that run large infrastructure. I think that's still clear trending. And obviously right now there's prevalence of AWS, now Google and Microsoft are becoming a lot more viable competitors that will help all of us out in terms of pricing, feature sets, and development and evolution of that side. And that just means that, quite frankly, a lot of the stuff that traditionally happened at smaller companies will no longer happen. They're going to be running on top of infrastructure service or platform as service, and that means that's going to force us to actually move up the stack. And obviously working closer with applications, working closer with mobile and obviously web engineers, and providing obviously all the valuable skill sets that we talked about all day long. But I think that's the clear trending.
So I agree with what Kevin and Greer are saying. I actually think that there's a risk to what the future looks like. So most companies at some point or another come into a bootstrap phase. You need people who actually understand the underlying infrastructure and what they're doing. You don't have automation yet. You can't plug stuff in an automated manner until you build robots. You still have to bootstrap servers. You still have to actually build that infrastructure. If we all go down the path of only learning code and we don't actually keep up with what's going on the lower level of the stack, I think we'll actually fail. So I would say that we have to be careful that doesn't happen. But in general, once sort of as you progress in a company or in your role or in your career, I see people going a lot more towards the performance tuning analysis. Like that's one route. The other route is also very, very deep troubleshooting, understanding way more about the vertical stack that you're on, and then being able to just be amazing at doing a specific thing.
Damn it, Peter, I was going to say that. So I'm going to be kind of the naysayer here. I'm going to say we're actually going to go in the opposite direction. I think while we are going to move up the stack in one way, there's going to be a greater emphasis on at least having the skills to be able to set up automation, set up configuration management, set up these basics that you need to bootstrap a system. And a lot of startups these days, in fact, I'd probably say almost all startups these days, when they get going, they don't have those skills on hand. They're expensive skills. They're not ones that you can afford to hire straight away. And if your developers don't already have them, then you just do without. But or you suck at it, right? So, but I've definitely seen a growing appreciation for being able to create reliable systems from day one. People come up and say, hey, I'm starting up a company. I need to know what I need to do in order to make my life easier a year down the road. They don't want to hire someone to do it, but they want to know what things that they should think about, what these important things are. So I think, it may not be that we as SREs start learning those skills. It may be that more developers, more people in sort of the bootstrap phase of startups have these skills. I think those are going to become much more common.
I agree with that, but also I think we're still at a stage where those common tools for integration and bootstrapping isn't quite where it needs to be. And open source. Definitely not there yet. So I think our job is to create that as well, like through open sourcing third-party software, to make that barrier to entry much lower than what it is now. And that happened on the obviously physical side for AWS and such, but that's the next, I think, what's coming up. And those skill sets will always exist. But I don't think those skill sets will exist in the smaller companies. There's going to be large companies and service providers, software companies, and open source community.
Yeah, I'll just add the same way that 10 years ago someone wouldn't immediately think to use something like Puppet or Chef or something like that. 10 years from now, there will be better examples, better templates. The sort of tooling that we have right now will seem just as ancient and old as what people were doing 10 years ago.
Yes.
It sounds like we're drifting the conversation towards the quasi-mythical full-stack engineer that I see in so many job
It's called the
I'm looking
unicorn.
at DevOps.
So I'm not saying that full-stack engineers don't exist. I think the definition of the stack, if sufficiently limited, probably allows for that. But I'm curious about how tenable you think that is. Like, every new layer of abstraction we add on doesn't actually make the job easier. It just increases the number of things that we have to learn about. It might make that particular interaction easier, but it adds more, and we need to maintain knowledge of every single thing that we add on, because every single thing we add on can break independently. How long can this last, where we're expected to continually maintain knowledge without having, some kind of transition layer, where we hand things off to somebody who has domain-specific knowledge of the lower layers? Because it seems like we're talking about that, so I thought I would just ask.
We already do that a little bit for like industry, like utility, for example. Though, like we already do that for electricity. I don't really know anything about generation. I know. I don't like. But what I'm saying here is like there is a precedent for this too. Like there are parts of the stack where we say like I don't know how to make ARM chips. You guys figure that out.
But we're already seeing that with network engineering.
It's true. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, I mean, what it comes down to is if the tools that you're using to try to do a better job are actually making your job worse, they're bad tools. And so the real problem is that the tools need to get a lot better than what they are right now. For a long time, a lot of this stuff was all closed up. It was all every company for themselves trying to make their own stack that worked just right for their company. And it's actually a push outwards now to say, hey, maybe we should all try to maybe figure this out together, because we're kind of all trying to do it by ourselves and it's really terrible.
Yeah, I think, as you said, the full stack is impossible. I mean, obviously, depending on how you define the stack, and you may be the first few engineers at a company, you just built an application. Yeah, you may understand all the dependencies in the beginning. That quickly does not scale, obviously, with complexities and all the companies that we work at. And that doesn't mean specialization, whether it be data center operations and planning, vendor management, all the way to capacity engineering to, as you said, network engineering, database engineering. So where does SRE fit in? Depending on the company, once again, all or very limited. At Dropbox, SRE actually encompasses a lot of all those functions in the same role, or the same SRE organization, and basically bridges everything above the physical layer all the way to the application layer. That's very broad, but is there a single person, single group within that organization that should understand full stack? No, I think that's unreasonable expectation.
Yeah, I mean, I'll echo what Kevin is saying, is that actually at some point or another, we won't be able to, right? Like everything will be extracted and codified in such a way that like automation takes care of it for you. In our environment already today, there is automation on the back end that humans can't grok anymore. Like they don't actually understand what's going on. It's hard to debug if it breaks, but at the same time, like it does a bunch of stuff that like just works, right? And so the risk there is that you lose the individuals who actually understand how that does work. And if you can still maintain that, then while you don't need to know everything about the stack, that individual component that does break, you do need to have somebody that understands that and how it connects to the rest of the stack, and they'll be able to actually help you to do that. And I think to echo Tom's point here, like for electricity, right? Like there are some people who really know how an automatic transfer switch works. There are some people who don't care, right? Even in the electrical field, right?
It sounds like we're saying we need better documentation. Yeah. I mean, in all seriousness.
Documents are code.
Documents are code. Yeah, just read the source code. It is the documentation. Yeah, I think everyone can agree. Like the full stack engineer who understands absolutely everything top to bottom just cannot exist. You do need to have domain expertise. At least in my team, I have a certain amount of expertise which is probably shared by one or two other people. And out of a team of 10, like there are other people who understand other parts of the stack. And together, you can imagine us as being the full stack engineer. But there's like 10 of us.
They have a t-shirt they wear.
Yeah, at the same time, it's got like 10 heads. So, but I think that's like the full stack engineer of the future. Like you have to have the group that understands everything, and you do need that, right? You don't want to end up in a situation where somebody over here kind of understands how one part works, and somebody over there understands the other part. You need it all in one place, and I think that's one of our strengths as SREs, is that as a team, as an organization, we can really bring that to bear.
I'm gonna ask a quick question of the group here real quick, to get back to kind of the SRE culture that the panel's about. So for all of you, the different organizations you've worked in, what are some common traits that you've observed of particularly effective SRE teams? And what are some patterns of ineffective SRE teams? Let's start.
The most successful teams I've seen have one very important thing at their core, and it's something that Ben talked about this morning, which is no blame postmortems. Every company I've worked at, every company I've seen that doesn't implement some version of no blame postmortems always ends up just imploding on itself. You need to have a culture where you can openly discuss things without finger pointing, without blame, and almost everything else can stem from that. Everything can grow from that. You can have collaboration, you can have trust, you can have cooperation. But if you don't have that, then I'm not really sure how things are going to turn out for you.
Yeah, I mean, to echo that, I think that's an interesting point, but I would also say that a really effective SRE team is one that's flexible and can build a relationship across multiple people and multiple teams. If you are dogmatic, if you are a bastard operator from hell, if you just say no all the time, you will be an ineffective team, or you will be an ineffective member of that team. I'd add that another thing is also being able to evolve in your thinking and actually understanding that what you're doing now is not the same thing that you will be doing in the future, and so you have to learn along the way, and you have to pick up new skills, and you have to do new things to be able to continue to be effective. Because as whatever service matures that you're working with, or whatever company matures, they will have different problems, and you'll need to be able to pivot to be able to deal with those problems. And so if you're not doing that, then it'll eventually fall into ineffectiveness.
Yeah, totally agree with what everybody said. There's a time. I'm fixated on the cloud.
You don't know that.
That's what happened.
Now we're all going to be looking at the
I
timer.
know.
Okay. You give us a number.
Obviously, everything starts with the people, and obviously creating the right culture around it, and everything that people said, having a blameless culture, integration with the engineering organizations, working in conjunction with everybody, and having the right set of priorities. And I think at basis, everyone that are in this room and working in SRE or operations roles, we all need to be able to work under pressure and handle pressure very, very well. I think that's a kind of basis. Because all the demands will come, things will break. Things will always break. Whatever people say, things will always break at the worst times possible, in the unexpected manners, because of cascading failure. So having all those kind of blameless culture, engineering integration, all those things.
Sure. I'll add in that groups that I've seen that have failed versus groups that I've seen that have succeeded have been ones that were able to foster mutual respect between their software engineering teams and the SRE teams. SRE teams that basically created wars with their software engineering teams or vice versa have always failed, and the inability for management in certain situations to either head that off, or the SREs themselves to not be taken out of the loop, or the software engineers not to be taken out of the loop, created a poisonous environment where those teams just did not succeed. And so there's been plenty of times where I've seen them fail that same way, and then plenty of times where I've seen the SRE teams or the software engineering teams step up and really just prove to one another that, hey, we respect you, we respect your opinions, we value what you bring to the table from both sides. And those have been the teams that have really worked out well, and that comes back to the what worth does SRE bring to the table, and so establishing that early on really helps people foster the relationship that's needed to make it succeed.
I'm going to ask one last question of everybody on the panel. This is kind of relevant to mostly larger organizations, but it's a challenge that I've seen a few times and always seems to really can be rough. Whenever an organization grows to the point that it needs to essentially provide 24/7
They're tearing down the walls.
Overload site.
We're gonna have a post-mortem with that. Whenever an organization has reached the point that it needs to essentially provide some type of like 24/7 support, typically that means opening up a remote office, having a team in Europe or Asia or something like that. What are the challenges? I think you guys have definitely seen this. But what are the challenges that you've seen in actually translating an SRE culture, it might be a unique company culture too, to another place? And how do you make sure that the team in the remote location still feels like they're a part of the company and that they can contribute just as well as someone who's at HQ?
You have to start early in the life cycle of the company. One of the things that I'm a very strong proponent of is actually not just having other offices, but actually having remote employees. I know that's something that's not very popular with some of the bigger companies, and I think I genuinely think it's a shame. I think there's very strong benefits to having remote employees, and one of them is that you can start to foster this culture early. And out of my team of 10 people, the majority of us are actually remote. I live in Grand Rapids. We have people in the UK. We have somebody out here on the West Coast, and our headquarters are in Brooklyn. So we come together. We meet very regularly. We make sure we keep those relationships strong. We keep that culture alive as much as we can. And when we open up an office in another location, those people are already there, hopefully, to plant that seed of that culture and keep that idea alive. And if you do it that way, I think it makes things a lot easier. It's difficult having remote employees to begin with, but it's difficult having a remote office to begin with. Like you're not really winning anything by delaying that, and I think you actually gain a lot if you start out that way.
So I'd say that you have to have, so it starts with the hiring process, right? Like if you hire the right people that have the right mindset, that can collaborate with other people and they really think outside the box and understand how to engage with others, you'll eventually actually sort of converge to a set of cultures that you can actually use. But I would actually say that we should embrace different cultures. So it's probably incredibly difficult when you put in an office in Asia for it to be exactly like the one in the US or exactly like the one in Europe. The people that you employ there have different values. They react differently to problems. They react differently to how they speak to people or how to actually do the work that they need to do. So what you want to do is you want to find sort of like a common set of principles that you're going to follow, and then be able to actually then teach those people what those principles are and let them actually come up with how to do it locally. What I would say though is that in our experience, it's been that if you don't have the people around you to be able to perpetuate that culture, then it probably will fail. So, or you will have a completely, vastly different culture that you actually have a hard time then with managing. But if the team is self-contained, if they don't interact with anybody, if they actually don't know what everybody else is doing, if they don't know how they react to problems or how they interact, you will come up with a different culture. So try and mitigate that by putting people in that location, by hiring them in a way that you actually understand who they are and how they're going to engage with others.
Definitely sitting with the folks who understand the company culture and the organization culture, I think, is key. And I think for SRE, specifically for remote locations, you have to balance correctly for operational support versus project work. And I'm actually a firm believer that those offices, remote offices, need to have its own project work that's independent and they own a core area. Otherwise, coordination just becomes a little too difficult over time. Obviously, there has to be right documentation, among the face-to-face meetings and such, but there has to be its own projects and focus areas that remote offices will own, those teams will own.
Telepresence robots. No, I'm actually a remote employee for Square. I live down in Monterey, and so I'm only there 1 day a week. And so getting the culture to just embrace video conference and getting some telepresence robots really helped. Just being able to show up made the inclusion a lot better, and getting people just to put their face on your screen when they want to talk to you was really important. This worked out the same way at Yahoo when we installed a really expensive Cisco telepresence screen room where it made a big old circle table, and it really improved relations with the India team that I was partnering with for search advertising. Just being able to like sit down and make it feel like it was at a table and say, hey dude, what's going on? Really made all the difference.
All right, so that's basically it. So thanks to everyone who's on the panel. Thanks obviously to Usenix too for throwing this for the first time, and all the organizers. That's all we got. Thank you.